Now, I hope to do two things in this talk. I hope to convince you that free will is an illusion. And so I hope to take up the challenge that Dinesh laid down in the debate. And it's worse than an illusion. It's actually a totally incoherent idea, which is to say it's impossible to describe a universe in which it could be true. Not only is it untrue, it's hard to make sense of what's even being claimed to be true. And I also hope to convince you that understanding this truth about the human mind actually matters, and that it can change the way we view morality and questions of justice.
Man has free will to the extent that he knows who he is, not otherwise.
Now, the popular conception of free will seems to rest on two assumptions. The first is that each of us was free to behave differently than we did in the past. You became a fireman, and yet you could have become a policeman. You chose chocolate, but you could have chosen vanilla. It certainly seems like this is the world we're living in. The second assumption is that we are the conscious source of our thoughts and actions. And so that your experience of wanting to do something is, in fact, the proximate cause of your doing that something. You feel that you want to move, and then you move. Okay, you are doing it. You, the conscious witness of your life. Now, unfortunately, we know that both of these assumptions are just untrue. The first problem is that we live in a world of cause and effect, and there's no way of thinking about cause and effect that allows us to say that the buck stops here. Okay, the buck never stops.
Supposing there's a neurotic, difficult child, and one school of thought used to say, well, bang him about, beat him up, and maybe he'll change. But then they said, oh no, that's not fair to the child to beat him up because it was his parents. They didn't bring him up properly. And so then they say, well, punish the parents. Well, the parents say, excuse me, but our parents were neurotic too, and they brought us up badly, so we couldn't help what we did. And so since the grandparents are dead, we can't get at them. And in any case, supposing we could, we would pass the whole blame back to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And they say they started all this mess. But then Eve would say, no, the serpent tempted me and I did eat, and it was the serpent's fault. Well, you know, when God, in the story of Genesis, asked Eve, didst thou eat the fruit of the tree whereof I told thee thou shouldst not eat? She said, oh, but the serpent tempted me, and I did eat. And God looked at the serpent, and the serpent didn't make any excuse. He probably winked. Because the serpent, being an angel, was wise enough to know where the present begins. So you see, if you insist on being moved, being determined by the past, that's your game. But the fact of the matter is, it all starts right now. But we like to establish a connectivity with the past.
Either our wills are determined by prior causes, a long chain of prior causes, and we're not responsible for them, or they're the product of chance, and we're not responsible for them, or there's some combination of chance and determinism. But no combination seems to give you the free will that people cherish.
So the course of time is really very much like the course of a ship in the ocean. Because here's the ship, you see, and it leaves behind it a wake. And the wake fades out, and that tells us where the ship has been, in just the same way as the past and our memory of the past tells us what we have done. But as we go back into the past, and we go back and back to prehistory, and we use all kinds of instruments and scientific methods for detecting what happened, we eventually reach a point where all record of the past fades away in just the same way as the wake of the ship.
Now, you could consider a generic serial killer. Okay, his choice to commit his last murder was determined by neurophysiological events in his brain, which were in turn determined by prior causes. Bad genes, the developmental effects of an unhappy childhood, a night of lost sleep because a car alarm was going off down the street. Okay, these events precede any conscious decision to act.
I wonder if it's ever struck you how curious a thing it is that most of the things that we experience we regard as things that happen to us, which we ourselves do not originate, which are events expressing some sort of power or activity that is external to ourselves.
So what does it mean to say that this murderer committed his crime of his own free will? If this statement means anything, it must mean that he could have behaved differently. He could have resisted the impulse to commit the murder, or he could have declined to feel the impulse altogether. And not on the basis of some random influences over which he had no conscious control, but because he was actually the conscious author of his thoughts and actions. Now, the problem is no one has been able to describe a way in which mental and physical events could arise that would make sense of this claim of freedom.
And if you consider that, you realize that what you mean by yourself is rather narrowly circumscribed. Even events that go on in our own bodies are put in the category of things that happen to us in the same way as things that go on in the world outside our skins.
Now, when we assume that violent criminals have such freedom, of course, we reflexively blame them for their actions. But when we look at this wider net of causality, the basis for placing blame seems to evaporate. The moment we catch sight of a stream of causes that reach back into childhood and beyond, the sense of his culpability begins to disappear.
And we go back and back to prehistory, and we use all kinds of instruments and scientific methods for detecting what happened. We eventually reach a point where all record of the past fades away in just the same way as the wake of the ship.
And to say that he would have done otherwise, or could have done otherwise, had he chosen to, is simply to say he would have lived in a different universe had he been in a different universe. Now, as sickening as I might find such a person's behavior, I have to admit that if I were to trade places with him, atom for atom, I would be him. There's no extra part of me that could resist the impulse to victimize innocent people.
Now, the important thing to remember in this illustration is that the wake doesn't drive the ship any more than the tail wags the dog.
And even if you believe that every one of us harbors an immortal soul, this problem of responsibility remains. I cannot take credit for the fact that I don't have the soul of a psychopath.
If there's a thunderstorm or an earthquake, well, it happens to you. You're not responsible for it. But so in the same way, when you have hiccups, you didn't plan on it. If you have belly rumbles, you had no intention of doing it. And as to the catastrophic act of getting born, well, you had nothing to do with that. And you can spend all your life blaming your parents for putting you in the situation in which you find yourself.
Because that gives other people the impression that we're sane.
So if I had truly been in this person's shoes, if I had his genes and life experience and an identical brain or an identical soul in an identical state, I would have behaved as he did, and for the same reasons. That nobody picks their parents or the society into which they were born. Nobody picks the life influences that shape the development of their nervous system. You are no more responsible for the microstructure of your brain at this moment than you are for your height.
And this way of looking at the world in this sort of passive mood as something that happens to you goes right down to our general feeling about life.
So the role of luck in our lives appears decisive. One has to be very unlucky to have the mind and brain of a psychopath.
It goes down to the way in which, as Westerners, we have been accustomed to look at human existence as a precarious event in a cosmos that, on the whole, is depicted as being completely unsympathetic and alien to our existence.
Now, but the significance of luck is very difficult to admit because it seems to totally destabilize our sense of morality. And yet, in specific circumstances, it's very easy to admit. So if you imagine this murderer was discovered to have a brain tumor in the appropriate spot in his brain that would explain his violent impulses, well, then that is obviously exculpatory. Then he's just a victim, or we view him as a victim of biology.
In other words, if you're reared with a 20th century, or shall we say an early 20th century common sense, which is based on the philosophy of science of the 19th century, with its rejection of Christianity and Judaism, you regard yourself as an accident, a biological accident, in a stupid universe.
And our moral intuitions shift automatically. But I would argue that a brain tumor is just a special case of physical events giving rise to thoughts and actions.
Which is mechanical, but has no feelings, no finer feelings.
And if we fully understood the neurophysiology of any murderer's brain, that would be as exculpatory as finding a tumor in it.
A vast, pointless gyration of radioactive rocks and gas in which you happen to occur. Of course, if you don't have that point of view and you are more traditional, you look upon yourself as a child of God. And therefore, under authority. In other words, there's a big boss on top of all this who allowed you, at his pleasure, to deign to have the disgusting effrontery to exist. And you better watch your P's and Q's, because that Almighty is looking after you, with the attitude of this is going to hurt me more than it's going to hurt you. And when you look at the world in that image, or in the other image that it's a stupid mechanism, either point of view you take, you don't really belong.
If we could see how the wrong genes were being relentlessly transcribed, if we could see how this person's genome and entanglement with other people and ideas and events throughout life had sculpted the microstructure of his brain so that it was guaranteed to produce violent states of mind and violent behavior, the basis for placing blame, in the sense that we usually do, would disappear.
You're not really part of all this. And I could use a stronger word than part, only we don't have it in English. We have to say something like connected with it, essential to it. Or to put it in the strongest possible way, it is quite alien to Western thought to conceive that the external world, which is defined as something that happens to you, and your body itself as something that you've got caught up with, it is quite alien to our thought to consider all that as you yourself. It is quite alien to our thought to consider all that as you yourself, as you yourself. Because, you see, we have such a myopic view of what oneself is.
If you ask me then, why am I talking? Well, I could say I'm making a living this way, or I have a message that I want to get across to you. But that is not the reason. I'm talking for the same reason that birds sing and for the same reason that the stars shine. I dig it. Why do you dig it? Well, I could go on answering all sorts of questions about human motivation and psychology, but they wouldn't explain a thing, because explaining things by the past is really a refusal to explain them at all. All you're doing is postponing the explanation. You're putting it back and back and back and back, and that explains nothing.
Now, of course, this is a problem that scientists and philosophers are well aware of, and many people think they have arguments that allow us to keep free will in play, even in light of these facts. And I'll talk about some of those.
What does explain things is the present. Why do you do it now? Now, this is a slight cheat, because that doesn't explain it either. Because what happens now, just as the sound comes out of silence, all this comes out of nowhere. This is in connection with what I explained to you in another talk about the power of nothingness. All life suddenly emerges out of space, bang, right now. And to ask again, why does it happen, is an unprofitable question. Because the interesting thing is not why, but what. What happens? Not why does it happen. I can say, well, I am doing this now because I did that then. And so I am producing for you a continuous line of thought. But actually I'm doing it backwards. I'm doing it always from now and connecting up what I do now with what I did so that you can see a consistent story.
But I want to suggest to you that the problem of free will is actually deeper than this, is deeper than the problem of cause and effect. And most people think that we have, the problem is we have a subjective experience of free will, but it can't be mapped onto physical reality. You know, I'm about to argue that free will doesn't even correspond to any subjective fact about us. And if you pay attention to your experience closely, you can notice this. If you pay attention, you can see that you no more decide the next thing you think than the next thing I say. Thoughts simply appear in consciousness. Very much like my words. What are you going to think next? What am I going to say next? I could suddenly start talking about the pleasures of snowshoeing. You know, where did that come from? From your point of view, it came out of nowhere. But the same thing is happening in the privacy of your own mind. You've all made an effort to be here and to stay this extra hour to hear, presumably to hear what I have to say about free will. But there's also a voice in your head that is just saying things. Haven't you noticed? And many of these things have nothing to do with what I'm talking about. You're struggling to follow my train of thought, but there's competition. You suddenly start thinking things like, I should probably stop drinking diet soda. Thoughts just emerge in consciousness. We are not authoring them. That would require that we think them before we think them. If you can't control your next thought, and you don't know what it's going to be until it arises, where is your freedom of will? Now, at this moment, many of you are thinking, what the hell is he talking about? Here's what I'm talking about. You didn't pick that thought either. We'll come back to this point. Okay, so now, of course, in a sense, we do think our thoughts before we think them, or at least our brain does. And much of this thinking is something we never hear about. We're conscious of only a tiny fraction of the information that our brains process in each moment. And we continually notice changes in our experience, in thoughts and moods and sensations, and behavior, but we are utterly unaware of the neurophysiological events that produce those changes. We consider the sensation of touching your finger to your nose. Feel free to try this. There's no shame in this. Okay, the contact appears simultaneous, okay, but we know at the level of the brain that it can't be. We know that the input from the finger reaches sensory cortex after the input from the nose. And this is true no matter how short your arms or long your nose. Now, if you're of a mind to experiment, it works with your toes also. So, our brains correct for this timing discrepancy by clearly buffering the inputs in memory and then delivering the apparent simultaneity to consciousness. So our experience of the present moment is in a very real sense a memory of the present moment. And even the simplest conscious sensations are built upon unconscious mechanism and unconscious processing of which we are fundamentally unaware. Now, needless to say, this unconscious machinery also governs what we think and feel and do and intend as well, not just perception. And that is where notions of free will and moral responsibility begin to get squeezed.
I wonder if it's ever struck you how curious a thing it is that most of the things that we experience we regard as things that happen to us, which we ourselves do not originate, which are events expressing some sort of power or activity that is external to ourselves.
And many people have now demonstrated in a lab that a person's choices, behavioral choices, voluntary choices, can be detected some moments, sometimes seconds, before they are consciously aware of having made the choice. So the physiologist Benjamin Libet quite famously did this with EEG, but this basic paradigm has been replicated with fMRI and even direct recordings from the cortex in surgical patients. In each of these experiments, people are given a very simple task to push a left button as opposed to a right button, or to move their left hand versus their right hand. And they just have to watch a clock and decide when they were first consciously aware of committing to the left or the right. Okay, and you do this, and several experiments over the years have shown that people can go back and forth as much as they want. They become consciously aware of when they're committed, they make their choice, and yet the experimenters, by scanning the brain through one modality or another, know some half a second, depending on what the decision is, even several seconds before they do what they're going to do. Okay, so as a result of this work, it's actually scientifically uncontroversial to say that some moments before you are aware of what you are going to do in making a simple voluntary action, okay, at a time at which you appear to be subjectively free to do whatever you want, your brain has already determined what it is you will do. Okay, and then you become gradually aware of this decision while you still think you're in the process of making it. Now, needless to say, this is very difficult to reconcile with a conventional notion of free will, because this timing discrepancy demonstrates that it would be possible for someone to know what you're going to do before you do, and while you still think you're free to make up your mind. But the truth is, I think actually too much has been made of this research. The truth is, even if there were no time lag, even if a conscious intention were truly simultaneous with its neurophysiological underpinnings, there would still be no room for free will, because you still wouldn't know why it is you do what you do. And again, this is a fact you can notice about yourself directly. Let's run a little experiment. Think of a city, anywhere in the world. You can choose any city you want. And now, of course, I could have primed you. I could have artfully placed cues in my speech in the last few minutes that would make you more likely to think of Las Vegas, for instance. So just to be on the safe side, don't pick Vegas. But pick a city, any city, and just pay attention to what this conscious process is like. Now, the first thing to notice about this is as free a decision as you are ever going to make in your life. Okay, you have all the cities in the world to choose from, and I'm just asking you to pick one. Now, several cities have probably occurred to you, and just focus on one. So everybody got a city? All right, well, I'm sorry to say that you all picked the wrong city. Don't ask me how I know this, but I do. So I just want you to do this again, just so you can see what the process is like. Pick another city, can't be the first, and notice what that experience is like. Okay. Did you see any evidence for free will? Now, we better be able to find it here. I mean, if it's not here, it's not anywhere. So let's look for it. First, let's set aside all those cities whose names you don't know and therefore could not have picked. Okay, because you couldn't have picked one of those if your life depended on it. There's no freedom in that, obviously. Okay, and then there are many other cities whose names are quite well known to you, but which simply didn't occur to you to pick. For instance, perhaps Cairo didn't occur to you. You absolutely know that Cairo is a city, but for whatever reason, your Cairo circuits were not engaged. Okay, as a matter of neurophysiology, Cairo was not in the cards. So I want you to think about this. Were you free to choose that which did not occur to you to choose? Based on the state of your brain a few moments ago, Cairo was not coming. Okay, where is the freedom in that? Of course, if you did think of Cairo, you should consider yourself a genius. Now, so you probably thought of several cities, and then let's say you thought of Paris and New York and Tokyo. And then you thought, I love Paris. I'm going to go with Paris. And the last minute you thought, no, Tokyo, I'll go with Tokyo. And now this is the sort of decision that motivates the idea of free will. You've got two or more choices, and you're picking between them, and it's just you and your thoughts. There's no coercion from the external world. You are doing it, apparently. But when you look closely, I think you'll find that you are in no position to know why you picked what you picked. In this case, why you chose Tokyo over Paris. I mean, you might have some additional story to tell about it. You might think, well, I had Japanese food last night, and so I remembered it, and I picked Tokyo. Now, of course, we know from psychology that these kinds of stories are rather often false. Whenever people are manipulated in a lab, they always have some tale to tell about why they did what they did, and it never bears any relationship to the actual variables that cause them to behave that way. So you give people, you can cause people to like one person more than another, or to cooperate more in economic games by simply giving them a hot beverage to hold as opposed to a cold one. And they never tell you that the reason they were biased as they were was because of the temperature of the cup in their hands. Okay, psychology is replete with evidence that we are very poor judges of why it is retrospectively, why it is we do what we do. But even if you're right in this instance, okay, even if your choice of Tokyo over Paris is based on your memory of having Japanese food last night, okay, you still can't explain why you remembered having Japanese food last night, or why the memory had the effect that it did. Why didn't it have the opposite effect? Why didn't you think, well, I just had Japanese food last night, so let's go with something new, let's go with Paris? The thing to notice about this is that you, as the conscious witness of your inner life, are not making these decisions. You can only witness these decisions. I mean, you no more picked the city you settled on in subjective terms than you would have if I picked it for you. So there was this first moment. I said, pick a city. and there's this hiatus where nothing has occurred to you. And then the names of cities start to get promoted into consciousness for reasons you can't inspect. And you can't choose the cities you think of before you think of it. I mean, it's almost like me saying Tel Aviv, Vancouver, Paris, and you simply hearing the words in consciousness. So if you pay attention to how thoughts and intentions arise and how decisions get made moment to moment, I think you can see that there's no evidence for free will, that actually our experience in life is compatible with the truth of determinism. Now, it's also important to recognize that the case I'm building against free will does not depend upon philosophical materialism, the idea that reality is at bottom physical. Now, there are very good reasons to believe that the mind is at bottom physical. Certainly most mental events are the product of physical events. I mean, the brain is a physical system, entirely beholden to the laws of nature. But even if we have souls, even if the human mind were made of soul stuff that we don't understand, nothing about my argument would change. The unconscious operations of a soul grant you no more freedom than the unconscious neurophysiology of your brain does. If you don't know what your soul is going to do next, you're not in control of your soul. This is obviously true where people behave in ways that they wish they wouldn't. So you think of all the committed Christians whose souls just happen to be gay. So that's obviously not an argument for free will, but it's also true when you do exactly what you wish you had done in retrospect. The soul that allows you to stay on your diet is just as mysterious as the soul that tempts you to eat a hot fudge sundae. So I think it's safe to say that no one has ever argued for free will because it holds great promise as an abstract idea. The endurance of free will as a philosophical problem in need of a solution is born of the fact that most of us feel that we freely author our thoughts and intentions and actions, therefore, however difficult it may be to make sense of this in logical or scientific terms. And the idea of free will emerges from a felt experience. Now, at the moment, the only philosophically respectable way to defend free will in light of what we know to be true scientifically is to endorse a view that's usually termed compatibilism in philosophical circles, and to argue, in essence, that free will is compatible with the truth of determinism. Now, compatibilists generally claim that a person is free as long as he's free from any outer or inner compulsion that would prevent him from acting on his actual desires and intentions. So if a man wants to commit a murder, and he does so because of this desire, well, then that's all the free will you need. But from both a moral and scientific point of view, this seems to me to just miss the point. Where is the freedom in doing what one wants when one's wants are the product of prior causes which one cannot inspect and therefore could not choose, and one had absolutely no hand in creating? I mean, from my point of view, compatibilism is essentially the dictum, a puppet is free as long as it loves its strings. Now, it's true that compatibilists push back here. And they say that even if our thoughts are the product of unconscious causes, they're still our thoughts and actions. Okay, anything that your brain does or decides is something that you have done or decided. So on this account, the fact that we can't always be aware of the causes of our conscious thoughts and actions does not negate free will, because the unconscious neurophysiology of your brain is just as much you as your conscious thoughts are. But this seems to me to be just a bait and switch. This trades a psychological fact, the subjective experience of being a conscious agent, for a conceptual understanding of ourselves as persons. The psychological truth is that people feel identical to and in control of a certain channel of information in their conscious minds. And they are mistaken about this. The compatibilist comes in and says, actually, you're much more than that. You are the totality of unconscious processing in your brain as well. But this is like saying you're made of stardust, which of course you are, but you don't feel like stardust. And the knowledge that you're stardust is not driving your moral intuitions or determining our system of criminal justice. You can't honestly take credit for your unconscious mental life. In fact, you're making countless decisions, quote, decisions, with organs other than your brain at this moment. Are you making red blood cells at this moment? Now, hopefully your body is, but if it decided to stop, you wouldn't be responsible for that change. You would be a victim of that change. There are more bacteria in your body than human cells. 90% of the cells in your body are microbes like E. coli. 99% of the functional genes in your body belong to them. You don't feel identical to these creatures. And many of them perform necessary functions. They are you in some larger sense because your well-being depends on them. So to say that you are responsible for everything that goes on inside your skin because it's all you is to make a claim that bears absolutely no relationship to the actual experience that has made free will a problem for philosophy. The truth is we feel or presume an authorship over our own thoughts and actions that is illusory. If I could detect all of your conscious thoughts and intentions and subsequent behaviors with a brain scanner some moments before you were aware of them, you would be rightly shocked because it would undermine your sense that you are the prime mover of your inner life. How can we be free as conscious agents if everything we consciously intend was caused by events in our brain which we did not intend and over which we had no control? We can't. So what does this mean? Well, first here is what it doesn't mean. The fact that our choices depend upon prior causes does not mean that choice doesn't matter. This is one point of confusion that people have. They confuse determinism with fatalism. And they think, well, if it's all determined, why should I do anything? Why not just sit back and see what happens? To sit back and see what happens is also a choice that has its own consequences. And it's very difficult to do. You just try staying in bed all day waiting for something to happen. You'll very quickly feel the urge to get up and do something, and resisting this impulse will actually take more effort than going with it. It actually becomes harder to do nothing than to do something very quickly. So you can't step out of this stream of choices and efforts. And this is and clearly choice and effort is part of the causal chain of life. If I hadn't decided to write a book on free will, it wouldn't have written itself. So effort and discipline and willpower, these are all causal states of the brain that beget their own behaviors, and behaviors lead to outcomes in the world. So the choices we make in life are as important as most people think. But the next choice you make will come out of a wilderness of prior causes that you can't see and did not bring into being. So, while it's true to say that a person would have behaved differently in the past had he chosen to, this doesn't give the kind of free will that most people seem to want. Because from the perspective of your conscious mind, you are no more responsible for the next thing you think and therefore do than you are for the fact that you were born into this world. You have not built your mind. And in moments where you seem to build it, where you make an effort to learn a new skill or to improve yourself, Okay, the only tools at your disposal are those which you've inherited from moments past. Now, I'm not even slightly suggesting that we all just blame our parents for everything that has gone wrong in our lives and do nothing. Okay, it is possible to change. In fact, from my point of view, viewing oneself as an open system, open to myriad influences, makes change seem even more possible. Okay, you are by no means condemned to be who you were yesterday. In fact, you can't be that person. The self is a process. This is what makes growth possible. The self is not a stable entity. But subjectively speaking, the unfolding of our lives is a fundamentally mysterious process. None of us know how it is we came to be in this moment. And we don't know what's going to happen next, really on any level. We don't know what we're going to think and feel next. Now, this might sound scary to some of you, but I think recognizing this can be quite liberating. The present moment is a mystery. No matter how much you know about the world, the present moment is still a mystery. You are simply discovering what your life is in every moment. I mean, you may think you're doing something, but you, again, don't know what you're going to do next. So our choices matter, and there are clearly paths toward making wiser ones. I mean, there's no telling how much a conversation with a smart person could change you. But we can't choose what we choose in life. And when it seems that we choose what we choose, so perhaps when going back and forth between two options, we don't choose to choose what we choose. There is a regress here that ends in darkness. We have to take a first step, or a last one, for reasons that are subjectively mysterious. and therefore, to think the thought, I could have done otherwise, is really just to think I could have done otherwise after doing whatever I in fact did. And what I'm going to do next remains a mystery that is fully determined by a prior state of the universe and the laws of nature, including whatever contributions come from chance, quantum mechanical or otherwise. Quantum mechanics doesn't get you free will. And to declare my freedom in this context is really just another way of saying, you know, I'm not sure why I did that, but I don't mind doing it. You know, I'm not sure why I did that, but I don't mind doing it. So I don't mean to belabor this point, but in my experience, people have a really hard time with this. But just think about the context in which your next decision will occur. I mean, a decision of any size, to get married or not, to go to graduate school or not, to wear the red shirt or the blue shirt, anything that you could decide. Okay, you didn't pick your parents. You didn't pick your genes. You didn't pick the interactions or the effect they had upon you of every event and conversation and exposure to ideas you had in life. I mean, where is the freedom in this? Yes, you are free to do what you want even now, but where do your wants come from? Okay, so let's return to this issue I raised at the beginning of the talk, because the great worry, obviously, is that any honest discussion of the underlying causes of human behavior seems to leave no room for moral responsibility. In fact, the Supreme Court of the United States has just come out and said this, that free will is incompatible with our, or rather inconsistent with the underlying precepts of our criminal justice system, and that it's a universal and persistent foundation for our system of law. So this idea of free will is actually doing work in our world. This is not just an academic discussion. Now, the problem, obviously, is that if we begin to view people as neuronal weather patterns of a sort, it becomes very difficult to make sense, or seems to become difficult to make sense of notions of right and wrong and good and evil. Well, happily, I think we can maintain a very strong sense of morality and an effective criminal justice system without lying to ourselves about the causes of human behavior. What do we most condemn in people, both morally and legally? It's really the conscious intention to do harm. Now, why is the conscious intention to victimize another person so blameworthy? Well, consciousness is the place where most of your mind seems to be active, where the global properties of your mind get invoked. Consciousness is where your beliefs and desires and prejudices and goals get together. Our conscious, premeditated behavior says the most about us and about what we're likely to do in the future. If you decide to kill your neighbor after weeks of library research and debate with your friends, okay, well then killing your neighbor really says a lot about you. But the point is not that you are the sole independent cause of your actions. I mean, after all, you didn't make yourself. The point is that for whatever reason, you have the mind of a murderer. Now, you're not ultimately responsible for having this mind. In fact, when we look at the details, we see that you're not even partially responsible for it. In the same way that a grizzly bear isn't responsible for the fact that it's a grizzly bear. But a bear really is a bear, and it really will eat you.
Now, the important thing to remember in this illustration is that the wake doesn't drive the ship any more than the tail wags the dog.
If you see one in the parking lot, it's worth worrying about. But you can worry about it without ever attributing free will to it. And you can take defensive action without doing so. Now, certain criminals are clearly more dangerous than bears, and we have to lock them up for a very long time, in many cases forever, or till the end of their lives, to keep them from harming us. And the moral justification for this is entirely straightforward. Everyone is better off that way. But retribution on this view doesn't make much sense. We don't seek retribution against bears. The idea of punishing people because they deserve it doesn't make much sense. But I would argue that dispensing with the illusion of free will allows us to focus on the things that actually matter: mitigating harm, assessing risk, deterring crime, all of the variables that govern the well-being of people. And so I'm not arguing that everyone is not guilty by reason of insanity and that we just have to empty the jails. Okay, and there's clearly a difference between voluntary and involuntary action, and there's a difference between the moral responsibilities that we can demand of an adult and those of a child. But you don't need free will to make sense of these differences. These are differences that relate to the global property of individual minds and of what it's reasonable to expect of those minds in the future. There are 13-year-olds serving life sentences in this country, not based on the idea that we have determined that rehabilitation in their case is impossible, but based on the fact that some judge or jury felt they really deserved this punishment, that they were the true locus of their behavior. Now, it seems to me that certain moral intuitions begin to relax the moment you see this wider picture of causality. Once we recognize that even the most terrifying people are in some basic sense unlucky to be who they are, the logic of hating them as opposed to merely fearing them goes away. And once again, this is true even if you believe that everyone harbors an immortal soul. I mean, not anyone born with the soul of a psychopath is profoundly unlucky. So one consequence of viewing the world this way is that it reduces hatred, which I think, all things being equal, is a very good thing. It also increases empathy and compassion. I mean, take one of the worst people who've ever lived. Take, my current candidate is Saddam Hussein's eldest son, Uday Hussein. He really is about as odious a person as I can think of. And this is a guy who, when he would see a wedding in progress in Baghdad, would descend with his thugs and rape the bride. And in some cases, he killed and tortured and killed the bride. He did this more than once. I mean, the fact that he couldn't be captured, and therefore the fact that we killed him, I think, is a very good thing. Unless you are a total pacifist, you have to admit that this is what guns are for. To kill people like Uday Hussein. Okay, but simply walk back the timeline of his life. Think of him as a 4-year-old boy. You know, he might have been a strange child. He could have been a scary child. I mean, there are actually psychopathic children.
Okay. What was your brother doing when you were doing this?
Playing with the toys.
Okay. Was he asking you to stop when you were doing it? What was he saying?
He said, "Dad, stop."
And what did you do?
That didn't stop. I just kept on hurting him.
What were you thinking when you were doing that?
Thinking of killing him.
How did you stop? What made you stop?
But he was also a very unlucky child. I mean, he had Saddam Hussein as a father. Now, how unlucky can you get? He was the 4-year-old boy who was destined to become the psychopath Uday Hussein. If we could have intervened at any point in his lifeline, at 4 or 5 or 6 or 7, and helped him, that would have been the right thing to do, and compassion would have been the right motive. So, on my view, this is actually a doorway into feeling compassion for even the worst people who have ever lived. So, ironically, to Dinesh's concern, if you want to be like Jesus and love your enemies, or at least not hate them, one way of doing it is to take a larger picture of scientific causality into account. Now, I'm also not arguing that it would be easy to adopt this perspective if you or someone you love has been the victim of a violent crime. It's perfectly natural to hate the person who has victimized you. But I'm talking about how we need to view the world in our more dispassionate moments. And this is the place from which we make public policy and do science, obviously. To see how fully our moral intuitions would need to shift, just imagine what would happen if we had a cure for human evil. Okay, if we fully understood psychopathy, its neural underpinnings, and we could cure it. And just imagine, for argument's sake, that this cure is trivially easy to administer, it's safe, it's painless, you can just drop it into the food supply, like vitamin D. Okay, so now evil is just a nutritional deficiency. Okay. Now imagine this cure for evil exists, and imagine the moral logic of withholding this cure from a murderer as part of his punishment. Okay, that makes no sense. But imagine withholding surgery from a murderer with a brain tumor when we know that the brain tumor was actually the cause of his violent behavior. As a punishment, withholding that surgery. That makes no sense. So I would argue that this reveals that our urge for retribution is actually an artifact of our not seeing the causes, the true causes of human behavior.
If I define myself as the whole field of events, we'll say the organism-environment field, which is the real me, then all the things that happen to me may be called my doing. And that is the real sense of karma. But when we speak about freedom from karma, freedom from being the puppet of the past. That simply involves a change in your thinking. It involves, in other words, you're getting rid of the habit of thought whereby you define yourself as the result of what has gone before, and instead get into the more plausible and more reasonable habit of thought, in terms of which you don't define yourself in terms of what you've done before, but in terms of what you're doing now. And that is liberation from the ridiculous situation of being a dog wagged by its tail.
Again, I think this is a sign of our confusion. The problem is not merely that free will doesn't make sense objectively. It doesn't make sense subjectively either. Okay, not only are we not as free as we think we are, we don't feel as free as we think we do. So on my view, the illusion of free will is itself an illusion.
It is quite alien to our thought to consider all that as you yourself.
But there is no illusion of free will. Thoughts and intentions simply arise in the mind. What else could they do?
So therefore, if you understand perfectly clearly that you can't do anything to find that very, very important thing, God, enlightenment, nirvana, whatever, then what? Well, I find, it's so stupid, because even if I tell myself, well, there's nothing I can do about it, why did I say that? You see? Why did I say that? Why did I go out of my way to tell myself there's nothing I can do about it? Because in the back of my mind there was a funny little feeling that if I did tell myself that, something different would happen. See? All right. So even that doesn't work. Nothing works. Now, when absolutely nothing works, where are you? Well, here we are. I mean, there's this feeling of something going on. Now, the world doesn't stop dead when there's nothing you can do. There's something happening. Now, just there, that's what I'm talking about. There's the happening. When you are not doing anything about it, you're not doing anything about it, you just can't help it. It goes on despite anything you think or worry about or whatever. Now, there is the point. Right there. And remember, although you will think at first that this is a kind of determinism, there are two reasons why it isn't. One, there is nobody being determined. Now, other people think of determinism as the direction of what happens by the past, the causation of what happens by the past. Now, if you will use your senses, you will see that that is a hallucination. The present does not come from the past. If you listen, and only listen, close your eyes, where do the sounds come from, according to your ears? You hear them coming out of silence. The sounds come, and then they fade off. They go like echoes, or echoes in the labyrinths of your brain, which we call memories. The sounds don't come from the past. They come out of now and trail off. You can do that later with your eyes. You can see, like when you're watching television, there's a vibration coming out from the screen to your eyes. And it starts from there somehow. Because we see the hands and then they move, we think that the movement is caused by the hands, and that the hands were there before and so can move later. we don't see that our memory of the hands is an echo of their always being now. They never were. They never will be. They're always now. So is the motion. And that is recollected as the trailing off echo like the wake of a ship. And so just as the wake doesn't move the ship, the past does not move the present, unless you insist that it does. And if you say, well, naturally I'm always moved by the past, that's an alibi. And it completely fails to explain how you ever learn anything new. That's why all the psychologists, who are mostly behaviorists, are completely bogged down in trying to find a theory of learning. Because according to the theory of learning that we have, everything that new that you assimilate is really only learned when translated into terms of what you already know. So, in that sense, learning becomes like a library which increases only by the addition of books about books already in it. A lot of libraries are indeed like that. So, that's what we call scholasticism. So then, you become aware that this happening isn't happening to you because you are the happening. The only you there is what's going on. Yeah, feel it. And disregard these stupid distinctions that you've been taught. I mean, stupid relatively speaking. And feel it genuinely. When you feel it genuinely, you get down to rock bottom, all that isn't there. That's a game that's been erected on it. And it isn't determined. In other words, you get this odd feeling of a synthesis between doing and happening, in which doing is as much happening as happening, and happening is as much doing as doing. And if you're not very careful at that point, you'll proclaim yourself God Almighty, in the Hebrew Christian sense. Like Freud alleges babies feel that they're omnipotent. And in a way they are. I am omnipotent insofar as I'm the universe. But I'm not omnipotent in the role of Alan Watts. Only cunning. So now then, this sensation of the happening is basic to all we want to explore. It's there as you see you can't do anything. And as you see you can't do anything, you don't go and distract yourself with something else, like committing suicide, or getting drunk, or any sort of distraction. Because if you do that, you will miss what follows from the feeling of what is going on when you're not doing anything. When you're not able even to not do anything. See, this is a sticky place. You can't get in and you can't get out. That's why it's called in Zen the mosquito biting the iron bull. Or the man who swallowed the ball of red-hot iron, which he can't gulp down and can't spit out. See, it's that difficult. What are you to do or not do? And that tells you, you see, that dilemma. That what you thought was you just isn't there at all. Now don't make it difficult, because that's a form of evading it. Don't make it easy. That's a form of evading it. It's neither difficult nor easy, because if it were difficult, it would have to be difficult for someone. If it were easy, it would have to be easy for someone. And the someone we're talking about is just the one that isn't there. And if you think it is there, okay, it's a free country. You can have that thought, but it's a thought. In other words, your ego is a thought among thoughts. It is not, in fact, the controlling thinker, or the feeler, or the sensor. It's one of them. And so, therefore, this thing is going along. And as I say, we get anxious because we feel nobody's in control, but nobody ever was. You know, you've lived thus far a reasonably orderly life. I mean, there have been some catastrophes and messes, but it's amazing how we have got this far. I mean, the thing looks after itself. And you will well remember that a lot of times that when you thought you were in charge and doing something sensible, you did something extremely foolish. And when you thought you did something extremely foolish, it turned out to be a blessing. Well, that's the way things go. That's what it's going to all come to. With these physicists who think of the energy of the universe running down, dissipating in radiation, gradually, until there's nothing at all left. And for some reason or other, we're supposed to find this depressing. But if somebody is going to argue that the basic reality is nothingness, where does all this come from? Obviously from nothingness. Once again, you get how it looks behind your eyes, see? So cheer up, you see. This is what is meant in Buddhist philosophy by saying we are all basically nothing. When the sixth patriarch says the essence of your mind, that's how it is behind your eyes, is intrinsically pure. The pure doesn't mean a non-dirty story state of mind, as it is apt to mean in the word Puritan. Pure means clear, void. So you know the story when the sixth patriarch was given his office as successor because he was truly enlightened. There was a poetry contest, and the losing one wrote the idea that the mind, the consciousness, was like a mirror which had to be polished. And constantly I have to polish my mirror, I have to purify my mind, see, so that I'm detached and calm and clear-headed and Buddha'd. But the one who won the contest said, there is no mirror. And the nature of the mind is intrinsically void, so where is there anywhere for dust to collect? See? So in this way, by seeing that nothingness is the fundamental reality, and you see it's your reality, then how can anything contaminate you? Or the idea of your being scared and put out and worried and so on is just nothing, it's a dream. Because you're really nothing. But this is the most incredible nothing. And the sixth patriarch, likewise, went on to contrast emptiness of indifference, which is sort of blank emptiness. See? If you think of this nothingness as mere blankness, and you hold on to the idea of blankness, and kind of grisly about it, you haven't understood it. He said nothingness is really like the nothingness of space, which contains the whole universe. All the sun, moon, and stars, and the mountains and rivers, and the good men and the bad men, and the animals and the insects, the whole bit, all are contained in void. So out of this void comes everything, and you are it. What else could you be? See, so what I'm showing you is that all this hocus pocus about the fear of nothingness is that truly speaking, nothingness is what we want to talk about when we talk about the spiritual. Only it's all been ignored. It's all been put down. And say, oh, nothingness. Bleh! Heaven preserve us from that. But that's where the secret lies. And obviously the secret always lies in the place you'd never think of looking for it. In mythology, this comes again and again. Okay, this is Christmas. Where is the Christ born? In a palace? No. Where nobody would think of looking. In pigsty. I thought that was rather funny. Well, we don't know who the prince is without the carpenter, do we?
Now, some of you might think this sounds very depressing. Okay, it seems to take something away from us. It does. It takes away an egocentric view of life. But I think this can be tremendously liberating. Okay, we are not truly separate. We are linked to each other and to our past and to history. We are part of a system, and therefore what we do matters. You can't take credit for your talents, but it matters that you use them. You can't really be blamed for your weaknesses, but it matters that you correct them. So pride and shame don't make a lot of sense in the final analysis. But they weren't much fun anyway. These are isolating emotions. What does make sense is a commitment to well-being and to improving your life and the lives of others. Love and compassion make sense. And of course, nothing that I've said reduces the value of political freedom or social freedom. I mean, having a gun to your head is still a problem worth rectifying wherever intentions come from. But the idea that we as conscious beings are deeply responsible for the character of our own minds is just impossible to map onto reality. And if we want to be guided by reality, rather than by the fantasy life of our ancestors, I think our views on this topic have to change. Thank you very much.